Hello, welcome to Theology Thursday. Today I want to talk about something called the inviolability of Zion theology. What in the world is that, you ask? Well, we need a little bit of Bible history to understand this, and then we'll apply it to where we live today and how we live today. So they take the land under Joshua, then they ask for a king. God gives them Saul, and then David. David's this great king. He conquers a neutral city, Jerusalem, and makes it his capital. Then he brings the tabernacle into the city of Jerusalem, and he wants to build a temple, but God says, no, we'll reserve that for your son. So David does everything he can to prepare the way, writes the songs, collects the instruments and the singers and the whole 9 yards, and then after David's death, Solomon becomes king, builds the temple. So now they have the temple in Jerusalem. The temple had 3 primary sections. There's the large outside court. Then there's a building, the temple proper, which has 2 parts, the holy place and the Holy of Holies. And the temple, of course, was patterned after the tabernacle that was given to them in the wilderness. In the early 700s BC, about 722 to be exact, Sennacherib V, the king of Assyria, defeats the 10 northern tribes, comes and surrounds the city of Jerusalem. Hezekiah the king takes a letter that the Assyrians have given to him, telling him you need to surrender, basically. He takes that letter and he lays it on the altar before the Lord and prays, and God sends an angel and wipes out 185,000 Assyrian troops that night and delivers the city. From that event, there developed the idea that, watch how it goes. We have God's land, we have God's city, which is Jerusalem. God's city sits on God's mountain, Zion. So God's mountain, Zion, with God's city on it, Jerusalem. In the city of Jerusalem, we have God's house. The temple oftentimes is called the house of the Lord. So we have God's house. So God's mountain, God's city, God's house. And in God's house, we have his throne room. That's the Holy of Holies. And in the throne room, we have God's throne. That's why it's called the mercy seat. It was where God would sit as the king, so to speak. And so there developed this idea that because it's God's throne and God's throne room, in God's house, in God's city, on God's mountain, he will never let it be destroyed, ever. Now, Jeremiah comes along, and in chapter 7, he says, you trust in these empty words, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord are these. And he tells them they're going to be destroyed. And sure enough, the temple would eventually be destroyed. So this idea that God's mountain with God's city, with God's house, with God's throne room, with God's throne, therefore he'll never let it be destroyed, was almost in a sense correct. And I'll show you why from the book of Ezekiel. So in the book of Ezekiel, we find kind of a string of passages. So the first one is Ezekiel 9:3. Now the glory of the God of Israel had gone up from the cherub on which it rested to the threshold of the house. And he called the man clothed in linen, so on and so forth. So here's what we have in Ezekiel 9:3. The cloud, which is the glory of God, leaves the throne and the throne room and goes out to the threshold, to the doorway of the temple of God's house. Okay. The next passage we have is chapter 10, verse 4. Excuse me. And the glory of the Lord went up from the cherub to the threshold of the house, and the house was filled with a cloud, and the court was filled with the brightness of the glory of the Lord. So now he's left the house and gone out to the courtyard, the farthest outer precinct of the temple. Okay, so Ezekiel's got this vision of the glory of God moving like this. The next one we find is again in chapter 10, and this time we find it in verse 19. And the cherubim lifted up their wings and mounted up from the earth before my eyes. They went out, and the wheels beside them, and they stood at the entrance of the east gate of the house of the Lord, and the glory of the God of Israel was over them. So we've gone from the throne room to the edge of the temple, from the temple out into the courtyard, now from the courtyard to the entrance on the east side of the courtyard, the outer edge of the temple. Then in chapter 11, starting in verse 22, then the cherubim lifted up their wings with the wheels beside them, and the glory of the God of Israel was over them. And the glory of the Lord went up from the midst of the city and stood on the mountain that is on the east side of the city. Okay? So here's what happened. The glory of God, the presence of God, has left the throne room, left the temple, left the courtyard, and now has left the city. Okay? So with God not present on his throne, in his throne room, in his house, in his city, on his mountain, now the city is ripe for destruction. And sure enough, that is exactly what happens. The city is destroyed. Now, if we look later in Ezekiel, we're actually going to get a little bit of a message of hope here. In chapter 43, Ezekiel is going to have another vision. And behold, the glory of the God of Israel was coming from the east, and the sound of his coming was like the sound of many waters. There shone his glory. So now, this is Ezekiel's got now a vision of the future, the far future, and he sees the glory now returning. It went and left to the east, Mount of Olives, but now it is returning, God's glory. The next one is in verse 4. And the glory of the Lord entered the temple by the gate facing east. So he's now returning the presence of God. The next verse we see, again in chapter 43, the very next verse, verse 5, the Spirit lifted me up and brought me into the inner court, and behold, the glory of the Lord filled the temple. So Ezekiel's got this vision of a new temple in the far distant future, and now he sees God's glory returning to fill the temple. And then the last one we find is actually in chapter 48, the very, very end of the book. Ezekiel has this description of what it's going to be like in this final temple. So the very last verse of Ezekiel, 48:35, the circumference of the city will be 18,000 cubits. That's 27,000 feet. And the name of the city from that time on shall be, the Lord is there. God's presence returns. So Ezekiel's image of a far future hope. So I wanted to put that in there. But I want to go back to this idea of this inviolability of Zion theology, that we have God's mountain, with God's city, with God's house, with God's throne room, with God's throne. Therefore, we can never be defeated. There is a similar theology that has developed, particularly in American Christianity, somewhat in other parts of Europe, but especially in American Christianity, called the security of the believer. Now, the idea of this is that once you are saved, you're always saved. You cannot lose your salvation. Salvation is not like your car keys. There are plenty of people that have lost their keys, can't find them. And so now there's reason for that, because people don't have a place to put them, or they always hang them in their house or a drawer or something, and so they misplace their keys and lose them. People lose their wallet, lose their phone. We lose things all the time. Salvation is not like that. It's not something we have that we can lose in that sense. Salvation is something that you are. And so, I am saved. I don't really have salvation like I have a car or a house or books or something. So I am saved. So the reality, it is true that if you are saved, you're always saved. Jesus said, no man can pluck you out of my hand. Matter of fact, Romans 8 declares that our future glorification is just as sure and done and completed and finished as our salvation. And so there's nothing that can take that away. However, many people think of it as, no matter what I do, I won't lose my salvation. That simply is not correct. That is not what the Bible teaches. The Bible does not teach an inviolability of salvation, that, I prayed a prayer when I was in the third grade at a vacation Bible school, and so that guarantees me heaven no matter what I do. That is really not what the Bible teaches. What the Bible teaches is, yes, if you have Jesus, you're his forever and nothing can take that away. So that is true. However, if you live in open defiance of God and you are genuinely saved, you will be punished by God. Hebrews makes this abundantly clear, explicitly clear. And there are many other passages as well about pruning and disciplining, and the Lord chastens those that he loves, kind of thing. And so the reality is, the way we live indicates whether or not we've been saved. That's the idea that's clearly presented throughout Scripture. Here's the way the Bible puts it in 2 Peter chapter 1, verse 10, which I think is really a good, succinct summary. Therefore, brothers, be all the more diligent to confirm your calling and election, for if you practice these qualities, you will never fall. In other words, I want to look at my life and ask, do I see the results of being saved? So many people have heard this inviolability of salvation theology that because you said a prayer or you did something way back there somewhere, that your name's on the roll and that's all that matters. No, it doesn't. The way we live indicates whether or not that was genuine. So let me give you a couple examples of the way I think we can see this and how it works. I have a friend who's a mechanic, has a shop behind his house, and his wife takes care of all the books and ordering stuff with him. They've had business for several years. Now, if he was to tell you, I'm a mechanic, and you were to say, oh, I need some work done on my car, do I just bring it by, make an appointment? Oh, I don't work on cars. What do you mean you don't work on cars? I don't work on cars. Oh, you said you're a mechanic. Yeah, I'm a mechanic. Oh, well, you're a motorcycle mechanic. No, I don't work on motorcycles. Well, you're a diesel mechanic. No, I don't work on diesels either. But you said you're a mechanic. Yeah, but I don't work on vehicles. Okay. You became a mechanic, so you work on your own cars. No, I don't work on my own cars either. I don't do anything like that. But you said you're a mechanic. You'd be looking at me and go, dude, you're not a mechanic. Maybe you went to class, and maybe you got some kind of certificate, but you're not a mechanic. I mean, do you own a shop? Not own a shop. I mean, you go, this is insane. Nobody's going to say I'm a mechanic, but they don't work on cars, they don't work on motorcycles, they don't work on diesels, they don't work on airplanes or helicopters, they don't work in any kind of machinery. You'd say, well, you may call yourself a mechanic, but you're not. I'm a professor in addition to being a pastor, and if you say, oh, you're a professor, where you teach? I don't teach. Oh, well, you're a writing professor. No, I don't write. Oh, well, you're like traveling and do conferences. No, I don't do any public speaking at all. So you don't write. Oh, you're a YouTube professor. You do a lot of YouTube. No, I don't do anything like that. But you said I'm a professor. But you don't teach. You don't write. You don't do conferences. I don't do any of that. But I'm a professor. No, you're not. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. The reality is the way we live shows what we are. And so this inviolability of Zion theology developed, and so the people would go out and commit every kind of gross, heinous sin imaginable. And again, Jeremiah chapter 7 covers this at length. They would do these things and think, well, it's okay. Because God's never going to let us be destroyed because, well, it's God's mountain Zion with his city Jerusalem, with his house, the temple, with his throne room, the Holy of Holies, and his throne. He'll never leave it. So it doesn't matter what we do. We can live however we want to. We don't need to live in fidelity to God. And so that was a horrible theology they developed, and unfortunately, it brought them to ruin in 586 when it was actually destroyed. And so I would not want you to stand before God and say, yeah, but I got the certificate. I got a letter from the pastor. I was baptized. Or, I said these magic words when I was a teen at youth camp or whatever. And so, that's good. And he's going to say, no, I never knew you. Bible uses the word fruit. You look at the fruit. And so an apple tree makes apples, and an orange tree makes oranges, and a grapefruit tree makes grapefruits, and a banana tree makes bananas, and, so on and so forth. And so you look at the fruit, and there's no fruit. Well, it's because the tree's dead. So I want to go back to 2 Peter 1:10. I want to encourage you to do what he said, to confirm, to be diligent to confirm, to look at your life and ask, do I see a desire to serve Jesus? Do I see a desire to serve others? Do I see a desire to be faithful to him? Faithful to him in my finances, in my family, in my church life, in ministries that God has called me to be involved in, faithful to him in what I look at on the internet, just faithful to him in everything. Do I see that kind of fruit in my life? And so I want to encourage you, don't develop some warped inviolability of Zion theology that says, I'm in and I can do whatever I want to. It just simply is not what the full teaching of the Bible communicates. So let me finish again by encourage you, 2 Peter 1:10, to be diligent to confirm your calling and your election. So God bless you, and have a great day and a wonderful week.